You know when someone remarks, "Family always has your back"? Indeed, I used to think so. Let me set the scene. At 29, I recently discovered the hard way that family could occasionally feel more like a life sentence than a safety net. Most people would define a well-off house as what I grew up in. Fancy holidays, private education, the works. To strangers, my parents, my sister Sophie, and I together most likely presented the ideal family. But underneath the shiny surface lay an obvious disparity. Now 25, Sophie was, and still is, the golden kid. I've always been treated like, well, the spare. Things started to fall apart the day I graduated from college. Freshly armed with a degree at 22, I was prepared to face the world. Or so I thought. My parents were sitting down when they shockingly told me they were cutting me off financially. Not warning, not talking about it. Just a matter-of-fact statement declaring it was time for me to be independent. Sophie, who had recently begun college, kept enjoying their whole support at the same time. Tuition, shown, apartment, sponsored for. Allowance for monthly expenses charitable. At first, I struggled to understand it, like if they handed me a life preserver and then threw Sophie a luxurious yacht. Perhaps they felt I was more capable and older, but the trend became impossible to overlook over time. My dad would replace a car Sophie may crash without thinking twice. I scuffed enough to fix my old clunker when I dinged it in our driveway. While Sophie never even looked at her wallet, at family gatherings, they would expect me to pay since, "You're the man, it's your responsibility." When I asked why, my mother blew it off with, "Oh, she's still figuring things out." At 22, I was meant to have life all sorted out, but at 20, Sophie had a free pass to ride on their money. By the time I hit 25, I had totally realized I was on my own. While Sophie was finding herself on trips to Europe, spa getaways, and shopping sprees, all bankrolled by my parents, I was working long hours, paying off college loans, and barely scraping by. The cherry on top here is my 25th birthday was marked with a happy birthday text. The worst happened last year at a family dinner. Sophie's 25th was thrown a spectacular party at a 5-star restaurant complete with a designer cake and live music. Dad said casually that Sophie's automobile required costly maintenance. Then he turned to me, fork stopped midair, and said, "Why don't you chip in to help your sister out?" On my drink, I nearly choked. Here I was, still getting over years of financial hardships imposed upon me, and they expected me to rescue the golden child? I said to them straight out, no. And I made it abundantly evident that their partiality was obvious to me. My dad just shrugged and remarked, "Well, she's different. She needs our help." Sophie sat there looking haughty, and for the first time I saw how far their double standards stretched. That evening, I decided I had had enough. I answered just when absolutely required and had limited interaction with my parents. Though there is always guilt associated with leaving family, it was not easy. Yet, the tranquility I found was well worth it. I worked hard, paid off my debt, even bought my own house, and concentrated on me. I sensed for the first time in years that I was on stable ground, but Sophie's life, a slow-motion train disaster. Claiming it was too stressful, she left her work after a few months. Her credit card debt grew, and she leaned increasingly on my parents. Hoping she would figure it out eventually, they paid her rent, covered her debts, and kept enabling her. Spoiler, she didn't. And then, out of nowhere, my parents started phoning me again. I first paid it little attention. They had been quiet for a time, so I suspected something was wrong. At last I picked up, and following some awkward small talk, they arrived at the point. Thanks to Sophie's lifestyle, their finances were in chaos. They needed me to assist her. The audacity. Years of cutting me off and advising me to fend for myself were followed by their seeking of a bailout. That's when I realized this was only the start of a storm I wasn't ready for. When my parents summoned me over for dinner, I knew it wasn't only about catching up. Even as I entered the door, there was a tightness. Sophie's favorite meal, never mine of course, had been made by her mother, and they were all seated as though they had practiced for a family intervention. Not long after, I sat down with arms crossed and waited for the hammer to descend. Setting down her fork, my mother sighed heavily and added, "We need to talk about Sophie." The dialogue developed like the plot of a poor reality show. Sophie maxed out multiple store credit cards, defaulted on her car payments, and had credit card debt of more than $100,000. Designer clothes, luxury vacations, spa weekends, you name it, she'd charged it. Then came the real shock. My parents had been covertly paying her bills for years, hoping she would finally turn things around, and now their savings were almost completely depleted, and they were staring at me like I was their Hail Mary. With wide-open desperation, my mom came to me and pleaded, "We need you to help Sophie out. She is about bankrupt." My dad interrupted with his usual austere voice and said, "This is your responsibility as her brother. Family helps family. Duty is another thing." Right. They were asking me for $50,000. $50,000. To bail out the same sister who had spent her 20s partying while I worked 60-hour weeks to pay off debt. Apparently, the same obligation did not apply when they cut me off at 22 and instructed me to figure it out. The ridiculousness of it all struck me like a punch to the gut. "No," I answered coolly as best I could. "Her age is adult. She made decisions and must pay for them." The room got ice cold. The face of my mother crumbled, tears flooding her eyes. "How can you phrase that? Her is your sister. For your growing up, we gave so much, sacrificed. They would have cut me off without thinking twice and left me to fend for myself. Sophie, meanwhile, received a golden ticket to life. I brought this up, but they dismissed it as if it were ancient history. Then Sophie chose to make her big debut into the conversation. Real sobs, with quivering lips and all, she started crying. Her voice cracking, she continued, "I'm scared. I have no idea what to do. I could see this act before. I need you." Tears flowed, and everyone turned around backwards to console Sophie whenever her will was thwarted. Like I was meant to leap up and write her a check on the spot, my parents watched me expectingly. Still, not this time. "I'm not your safety net," I said firmly. "You have to handle this personally." My parents went nuclear at that point. My dad delivered the traditional "you've forgotten your values" speech. My mom claimed she was disappointed in the person I'd become. I accused my mom of deserting her family. Then came the shocking ultimatum. Sophie simply sat there, staring at me with red-rimmed eyes and a smug little smile like she knew I would finally cave. My dad urged, "Either you help Sophie or you're no longer part of this family." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For not helping them to tidy the mess they had let Sophie produce, they were ready to cut me off from their life. They seemed to have totally forgotten all I had gone through. I inhaled deeply, got to my feet, and responded, "If that's the case, then so be it." The immediate fallout was, my parents just sat there, gazing at me like I was the villain in some soap opera. Sophie bolted out the room screaming that I was selfish and heartless. I left without saying anything, and when I arrived home, my phone was exploding with furious texts from relatives. The next morning, I woke up to mysterious Facebook posts from Sophie about fake family and being betrayed by those closest to her. Her fans inundated her comments with sympathy, calling me out as if they knew the whole story. Sophie had obviously wasted no time spinning the tale in her favor. It was frustrating, but I avoided interacting. That evening, my dad texted me. It was brief and icy. "We expected better from you. You have let us down." I gazed at the television, a mixture of grief and resentment. I had bent over backward for years attempting to get their favor, and now they were throwing me aside since I wouldn't comply with their demands. The drama was still to come. 1 week later, I received a legal paper envelope in the mail. Claiming I'd verbally agreed to loan Sophie $50,000 at that family meal, my parents were suing me. The audacity almost seemed ridiculous. I understood then that this was more than simply about Sophie's debt or my parents' financial mismanagement. They were bringing me before court, seeking to subjugate me. This was about control, that which they still felt they had over me. But they were incorrect. I was not the naive, fearful child they had left at 22. This time, I was ready to fight back. Getting the lawsuit felt like something from a horrible daytime drama. My parents suing each other personally? For a loan I had never consented to. The treachery ached, but the ridiculousness of it nearly overwhelmed the suffering. Almost. I wasted not a moment. I phoned a lawyer the next morning and went over everything: the family meal, the years of being cut off, the favoritism, and now this ludicrous lawsuit. After listening carefully, he said to me something that chilled me to no end. They're not simply suing you for money. It was obvious they considered this as a power move, a means of guilt or intimidation meant to force me back off. But what they did not depend on was that I had gone through worse, on my own, and I wasn't about to fold again. My lawyer started right away. He first advised compiling proof, anything that would show I hadn't promised to give Sophie a penny. It dawned on me then that I had videotaped the family conference. At the time, it was more of a paranoid habit following years of being blindsided by family drama than about defending myself. But right now, that tape was excellent. I sent it to my attorney, who played it back grinningly. The audio was perfect. My parents asked me to assist Sophie, and I turned flatly away. It was all there, plain as day. There was no promise, no doubt. It was just a strong no. As my attorney worked on our defense, he began poring over my parents' financial records to learn their motivations. What he discovered was really instructive. My parents apparently had been using Sophie's financial problems as a tax write-off for their company. Their financial gain from her careless spending has come from her declaring her debt as business losses. Now, as their strategy fell apart and their coffers ran empty, they were frantic to keep the gravy train rolling. But the surprises did not end here. Working with my attorney, I started contacting relatives who had attended the historic meal in search of support. That's when my cousin, one of the few people who had always had my back, revealed another. My parents had surreptitiously mortgaged their house to pay Sophie's debts. Not even other close relatives, they had not shared with anyone. Since they were on the verge of financial collapse themselves, they were depending on me to swoop in and save the day. It was like removing layers of a rotting onion. It got worse the more I found. The same person who had chastised me at the family dinner, my aunt, had personal motives for supporting my parents. My cousin informed me she had been assured of a percentage on any money my parents acquired from me. They were bribing her to pressure me, hanging financial incentives meant to turn her against me. The betrayal was astounding. Then Sophie arrived. Following form, she brought the drama to social media. Her postings ranged from vague to fully emotional tales. She said she was having a mental health crisis and that her own brother had abandoned her in her time of need. Her supporters ate it up, showing her sympathy while denigrating me. Though it was terrible, my attorney's counsel was unambiguous. Stay away, let the proof speak for itself in court. Suddenly, an estranged uncle I hadn't spoken with in years contacted me. He had long since cut off ties to the family, and I never knew why. I did just now. He informed me that my parents had staged similar acts using other relatives as cash pawns in the years. Under the pretense of helping the family, they had one family member cover debt, only to leave them broke after the money was turned over. Equipped with this fresh knowledge, my attorney decided it was time to launch the attack. My uncle volunteered to testify, claiming he had been waiting for the opportunity to expose them for what they were. Citing Sophie's social media statements and my parents' baseless lawsuit, we developed a countersuit for defamation and emotional harm. That's right. While Sophie had been crying about being broke and on the verge of bankruptcy, she had been sitting on a secret cache of money. The true game changer came during a routine background check on Sophie, a concealed bank account in her name with almost $200,000 in it. Though her financial crisis was a fabrication, it was not evident where it had all come from yet. As we piled more evidence, my attorney was virtually ecstatic. At this time, my parents' attorney contacted with what most likely was an olive branch. If I would finance Sophie the $50,000, he volunteered to dismiss the case. As I heard it, I laughed aloud. Though they were trying to present it as a generous compromise, it was only a last-ditch effort to strong-arm me. I turned down the offer right away. By now, I was more resolved than ever. This was about standing up for myself, about at last releasing years of control and manipulation, not only about money. The courtroom was packed the day of the trial. While my parents and Sophie appeared assured they would win, they had no idea what was ahead. The court date loomed. Sitting at the front with Sophie, who exuded her customary air of arrogant confidence, as she knew she would have won, were my parents. Sitting with my attorney, I felt a mixture of anxiety and quiet resolve. My parents' attorney went first. This was it. The moment years of favoritism and manipulation would at last be brought under scrutiny. He wasted no time depicting me as the unappreciative son who had left his family in their hour of need. Speaking of family values, broken promises, he used terms like duty and responsibility, as though they were bricks meant to hold me down. His address pulled at the emotions, but the facts? Those were obviously lacking. Then it was my turn with my lawyer. He didn't hold back. He detailed my parents' years of obvious favoritism, their financial cutoff when I was 22, and the pressure they had on me to save Sophie while she led a free, ostensive existence. He presented it as a timeless classic case of the scapegoat against the golden child, and the atmosphere in the room changed. First, we put my estranged uncle to the testify. The court seemed fascinated as my lawyer told the tale, and then the surprises began to fall. He described in great detail how my parents had exploited other family members as financial safety nets in the past, therefore illustrating decades of financial manipulation by them. He discussed relatives they had persuaded to incur debt for the good of the family, only to abandon them in financial disaster. Whispers filled the courtroom as the stories developed. I watched my parents squirm for the first time. Sophie then stood up. I had refused to help her, so she put on her best sad act, crying about her financial difficulties, and claimed she had no choice but to rely on my parents. It was an Oscar-worthy performance, until my lawyer started his cross-examination. Pulling up Sophie's own social media entries, he projected photographs onto the courtroom screen. Shopping runs, luxury holidays, spa weekends, all time-stamped during the period she claimed to be broke. The audience hummed with whispers. Though Sophie staggered over her justifications, her cheeks grew beet red, and it was obvious damage was done. The major disclosure then was the secret bank account. Under the cover of financial support, my attorney showed records showing Sophie had over $200,000 stowed away, taken from my parents, and had been lying to everyone, pretending to be the victim. The audio clip from the family conference was the last nail in the coffin. My parents appeared really blindsided, their well-crafted story falling before their eyes. As my lawyer presented it to the court, the room went quiet as my parents asked me to assist Sophie. My answer was unambiguous. No, I can't do that. There was no loan commitment, only a categorical rejection that immediately ran counter to their assertions. When it came time for me to testify, I kept it straightforward. The judge's face grew stiff, and I could tell she was no longer purchasing a word of their case. I discussed being cut off at 22, trying to create a life while Sophie was handed everything on a silver platter. I detailed the years of manipulation, the ongoing pressure to save her, and the emotional toll it had taken. As I concluded, the courtroom was quiet. The weight of my words hung in the air. Following a little break, the judge came back with her decision. She decided in my favor and dismissed the action, paying me damages for emotional suffering and libel. My mom broke down in loud, dramatic tears as the verdict was announced. My attorney had done it. She clutched to Sophie, who avoided looking people in the eye and seemed enraged. With his shoulders slanted, my dad came up to me outside the courthouse. He said he had been blinded by bias and apologized, but I refused to let him off easy. Walking away, I replied, "It's too late for that." The aftermath was extensive in the next days. Quickly spreading stories about her secret bank account, Sophie's credibility among friends and relatives suffered. Once friends of my parents, relatives started contacting me to apologize for seeing their interpretation of events. Sophie's social media went dark as her once sympathetic fans turned against her. Though my parents begged for pardon in a lengthy letter, I found myself unable to reply. How could I believe them once all they have done? The reality was visible. At last I was behind me years of lies, manipulation, and treachery. But as I stood on the other side of this struggle, I couldn't help but question, was winning worth the price of losing my family totally? My life started to feel like my own for the first time in years during the weeks after the experiment. The lawsuit was done, and the judge's decision confirmed what I had gone through. Still, the battle left scars that persisted even as the dust settled. Sophie's reputation suffered most. Her secret bank account immediately went around our extended family. Friends who had before protected her now turned away from her obvious manipulation. Ashamed of her, her social media went black, and strange silence replaced the ceaseless stream of luxury posts and cryptic sob stories. Sophie wasn't the victim everyone wanted her to be, for all her theatrics. My parents told a different narrative. I got a letter from them not too long after the trial, long and full of floral apologies. It said they had made mistakes out of desperation and terror. Tucked within the envelope was a handwritten note from my dad, a cryptic riddle suggesting a hidden gift from the past. My mom wrote that they had cut Sophie off financially and wanted to make amends. It addressed safeguarding the family and my future. I hired a private investigator to examine the memo, and within a week they returned with an answer that left me reeling. Originally, I disregarded it as further deception, but curiosity tore at me. My late grandparents had established a sizable trust fund in my name years ago, intended to guarantee my future. But my parents had discreetly restricted my admission to college when I finished. They had kept it secret and directed their funds toward Sophie's way of life. It was not only partiality anymore, it was open stealing. With this fresh proof, I went directly to see my attorney. A few weeks later, the judge decided in my favor after we completed the required documentation to recover the trust fund. The minute I came upon the ultimate decision, I felt an odd mix of grief and success. Yes, I had triumphed, but at what expense? Broken as it was, my family had totally collapsed under the weight of their own lies. The trust fund enabled me start over. I moved to a little house in a different city, far from the turmoil and negative memories, started a nonprofit, and I had always imagined accomplishing something significant. And now I had the means to bring that goal to pass. The company concentrated on assisting victims of financial abuse, those who had been controlled and taken advantage of by people closest to them. Sharing my story on Reddit turned out to be an unanticipated means of healing. It felt like the ideal way to transform my suffering into direction. Thousands of people responded and shared their own stories on my viral piece about the trial and the secret trust fund. Reading their tales made me realize I wasn't only myself in what I had gone through. Every person who had tried to guilt me into helping my family, there were hundreds of supporters for my sticking to my values. One day, out of the blue, my estranged uncle phoned once more. Valuation I had not known I needed. He praised me for recovering the trust monies and made hints about additional secrets buried in the past of the family. I turned him down even though he volunteered to share them if I so wished. Family secrets and drama had enough of impact. It was time to advance, and I did. The organization prospered, and my work brought me fresh peace. Knowing that everyone engaged in Sophie's manipulation suffered, I gave a portion of the trust fund to mental health projects. One day, Sophie sent me a last message. I blocked my parents and Sophie on every platform, therefore disconnecting myself from the poisonous web they had created around me for years. I didn't reply. It was a meager apology with hazy vows to do better. In my heart, I had forgiven her for more peace than for her benefit. Still, forgiveness did not imply allowing her back into my life. Looking back, I find the family I once had as a far memory. The litigation, the betrayals, the manipulations, all of which fit a chapter I have closed permanently. And that freedom? My life is mine to live, free of guilt, free of expectations, free of the chains my family tried to bound me with. It is more valuable than any apologies or trust fund could be. Story 2. I always assumed, regardless of whatever, family would have your back. I suppose I got it wrong. Let me begin, nevertheless, at the outset. I came from a close-knit family where everyone knew everyone else's business. Birthdays, holidays, and those awkward Sunday dinners where my parents would insist on having meaningful chats about life. But strangely, it always felt like it was more about upholding appearances than genuinely bonding. We were always together. Still, I appreciated what I had, or at least I felt I did. I behaved like a decent son. Not the ideal one. That was Matt, my older brother. But I always aimed for moral behavior. Get good marks, keep out of trouble, and be on hand for my folks. When they had me, they were older. I was the only child they had left when Matt left for college and moved out. You could thus argue, I guess, that I was their last chance of someone doing as they wanted. Still, it never seemed like enough no matter how hard I tried to satisfy them. Never nearly lived up to their expectations. And that, I suppose, was the beginning of things going awry. When things began to fall apart, I was 25. Having gotten a great job and collected enough money to leave their house and into my own apartment, I had, though not much, it was mine. Like I could at last make my own decisions, live my own life, freedom seemed like liberation. But telling my parents about my new location seemed as though I had detonated an explosive in their universe. Their satisfaction was lacking. They were really somewhat let down. "You don't have to leave, son," my dad murmured, his voice low and austere. "Your house is this. Always here for you has been our nature. We quote, not getting any younger," my mother noted. "You should be helping us more, not rushing off to live on your own." I wrote it off at first, trying to seem confident, like this was no great deal. "I'll still help, I just need my own space," I added. Deep down, yet, I could sense their discontent. And that notion, that persistent nagging awareness that they would always find something wrong, stayed with me. A few weeks later, my dad gave me a call. It was odd late at night. Unless it was absolutely necessary, he hardly gave me calls. He seemed almost reluctant as he said, "Hey, son, we have to talk about something. Would you be able to visit?" I knew this was not a laid-back visit. It was more than just talking about the temperature or general state of affairs. No, this was indeed rather important. Heart thumping the entire way, I drove over to their house. Though I had no idea what was ahead, my gut felt dreadful. I stepped in when I arrived and felt the tension right away. Dad was seated at the kitchen table, his fists tightly closed in front of him, staring at the floor. With arms crossed, my mother stood in the doorway looking blank. "We've been talking," my dad remarked at last, his voice perhaps too calm. "And we're in a little bind, son. My stomach started to tighten. "What are you implying?" Trying to keep my voice calm, I asked. My mother added, "We have bills mounting up. And around here, things have been growing tougher. Though we have been managing, it has been challenging." Trying to keep cool, I nodded. "Okay, but right now you folks are good. You have been doing good for some time, really. What's changed?" Dad turned to face me then, and I saw something I had not anticipated. Desperation. He looked more like a man on the brink than just worried. "We are therefore seeking your assistance. To pay the following few months' bills, we need a few hundred. A couple hundred here." That seemed not too horrible, I considered. Then, speaking honestly, he said, "Maybe 1,000. 1,000. That was rather different. My heart sank. Personally, I was not in a very strong financial situation. My rent was not inexpensive, and I had a little savings account. When I could, though, I always tried to be helpful. I therefore agreed to lend them some of my savings. But there seemed to be something off. The sensation that this went beyond money persisted in me. They needed it. Hence, they were not seeking assistance. No, they wanted it. Thus, they were asking. Until the next several months, I had no idea how much I had been compromising. I handed them more and more, always believing it would be only temporary. A few hundred one month, somewhat more the next. I was here to assist each time they called. But the money was only one factor. It was the manner they made me feel as though I owed it to them. The guilt trips, the passive-aggressive remarks regarding their difficulties, and the apparent ease of everyone else. "You've got your own place, but we're still here, stuck with all this," they might argue. I started to despise them, but I never spoke out. I was unsure how. And then arrived the turning point. Expecting a calm evening, I visited their place one evening for dinner. When I arrived, though, I saw something unusual. My mother was on the phone with one of my aunts, murmuring something I couldn't quite hear. When she saw me, she hung up rapidly. It was too late. I had already picked up the tone she applied while discussing me behind my back. I gave it little thought, but that evening the topic took a different turn. Starting with casual remarks about my failure to contribute, my parents said, "It's getting hard to ask for help, and he never steps up." My mother even alluded to me having turned my back on them. That was the moment I noticed something was off. They were enlisting my family against me. I maintained silence as I had no idea what to do. Still, the doubt seed was sown. Following that evening, the suspense mounted. Every family celebration felt as though one were entering a lion's cave. I started to see my relatives acting far away. Not only were my parents involved, everyone was involved. Little changes and awkward looks when I walked into the room. The worst thing about it is nobody bothered me to find out. Nobody inquired whether I was struggling or if I was okay. They simply thought I was the selfish son who turned away from helping his family. I was the evil person. Still, that represented the least of it. My parents were ensuring everyone felt I was in the wrong. I was unwilling to help, they were telling everyone. Their telling of the tale seemed to have evolved into gospel. They portrayed me as the villain, that unappreciative son who would not even assist his own parents. The worst of all is also, it paid off. Messages wondering why I was being difficult began to arrive from my cousins. My relatives and uncles gently chastised me for being egotistical. I tried to reach out and cleanse my name, but nobody would pay attention. Already too far gone, too poisoned by my parents' story, was my family. There was no one on my side, and I felt as though I was drowning in a sea of falsehoods. At last, I went to face my folks. I could no more stand it. There are falsehoods, manipulation, and emotional blackmail. One evening, I gave them a call, and it was during that call the truth surfaced. Telling the family I was not helping, I addressed them on how they had been distorting everything. I informed them they had no right to denigrate my name and assign me the villain in their narrative. They did not find it appealing. When my dad answered, "We've always given you everything," his voice broke. "You find it easy for us to ask? You find it simple to acknowledge that we require assistance?" Though I wanted to yell at him and explain how it felt to have your own parents betray you, I restrained myself. Rather, I told them I could not continue like this. I found it impossible to remain their emotional punching bag, and I knew things would never be the same when I hung up that evening. I stopped speaking to them for some time. I wanted room and time to breathe. Still, the damage was already done, even though I severed communication. My family was split, and the lies had gotten too far off. There was an enormous emotional cost. I was losing the whole network of people who had formerly been my family, not only my parents. But among all of it, I discovered something unexpected. Strength. Strength to establish lines, defend myself, and let go of the poisonous aspects of my existence. Though it took time and was difficult, I came to see something quite significant. Family is not about duties or blood. It's about love, respect, and trust. Qualities I had never had from my folks. Even if the trip has been lengthy, I am better for it. I am free from the guilt, from the manipulation, from the stifling expectations. These days, I am not their hero either. I am at last starting my own.